You cannot improve the things that you don't know. And today we're going to be talking about feedback, specifically about how to get and improve your podcast through surveys. So, podcast analytics are tough. So, we need to get creative on how we measure our shows and how we apply that to grow them. So, I've been through a bunch of trainings recently and I've compiled some interesting things about the topic of podcast analytics. So I'm Sean Butler, host of the Meaningful Revolution podcast and certified high performance coach since about 2015. And I help people find and connect with their passions while preventing burnout so they can sustainably put out their creative works into the world. So today, what you'll learn specifically is how you can solicit feedback for your creative works, how to provide feedback for this show as we're making tweaks and changing it, what's wrong with current podcast analytics, and how to finish the year strong as we're getting to the end of the year. This is the Meaningful Revolution podcast where we help creators focus on the performance side of being a creator. And with that, let's jump into it. All right. So recently, I've been deep diving on podcast videos and courses, trying to figure out how to improve the show. And some of you may have noticed that there's been a new format for the show. I've been splitting my time from editing for the audio podcast, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or one of the many podcasting platforms. And for YouTube, I've found out through asking around that those are two different audiences, which makes sense from the data that I do have. And so I've been really focused on how do I measure the show to know if it's working or not, right? If you are new here, or you're an old friend, or someone that I've interviewed, or anyone else that's listening to the show, I'm very grateful that you're here. And the idea of podcasting, the whole technical nature of podcasting means that this is mostly a one-way street. I talk into a microphone and sometimes I hear back from y'all, sometimes I don't. And at the end of the day, it can be really frustrating or overwhelming or confusing as to if things are working, things aren't working, if you're getting value from this show or not. So those types of things. And so I really started to focus on that. So many things in life, we don't always get the feedback or have the information on how to improve. So how can we improve this? How do we figure this out? I think first off, the thing that comes to mind for me is a book called Measure What Matters. And I forget the author off the top of my head right in the moment. But the gist is the things that you are measuring are the things that you can improve upon. And so often we don't take the time to really consider what matters, right? So in the podcasting world, so I'll use example of this show in particular, since I have data for that and can speak to it. Most podcast platforms are Apple or Spotify. They measure things differently, which is annoying, firstly, right? So you're not comparing apples to apples if you're growing your audience on both of those platforms. And it's not counting every other podcasting platform that uses the RSS feed that I have for the podcast that doesn't track downloads or listens or comments or anything. Inherently, the ecosystem of podcasting doesn't help you with analytics, right? On top of that, most Apple or Spotify, you can track downloads. Apple has an engaged listeners statistic. It's really hard because all this data is in different spots to have an accurate picture of what's going on. One of those main things is downloads. That's something that my thing that I use to publish the podcast, which is Kajabi, can compile across all the different platforms, all the different downloads, which is great. It's a great estimate how well the podcast is doing, right? It doesn't tell me if people are engaged. It doesn't tell me how long people are listening. It doesn't tell me when people drop off, like YouTube, which is why I've been publishing this as a video podcast and like the metrics that YouTube provides, but it's a different audience altogether. So the trade-offs are there. But the question is, I mean, getting to this Measure What Matters book in a roundabout way, is, are downloads a good measure for the strength of a podcast? And through the different trainings I've been doing recently, the answer is no, right? There are many different ways this could go wrong with this particular measurement. And if you don't have a podcast, as I'm explaining this, think about the KPIs you have at work or the things that you're measuring on your creative measure or creative works, creative offerings, your podcast, your YouTube, your books, your sales, whatever it is in your life, and be thinking about, is this measure actually something that matters to the growth of my company, of my craft, of my personal growth? Because so many people don't ask that question enough. You might, as you're starting out, have an idea what that is, and then that's just the thing you're measuring. You get some momentum. You don't ever think back on it. But does that thing matter? And for me in the podcast, especially for the goals that I have for this podcast, which is to help creators not burn out, to help them with everything except the creative side of what they're doing. So how they feel about their work, how they feel about themselves, time management, productivity, how impactful their work is out in the world, those types of things. In the high performance side, as a high performance coach, this probably makes sense why I'm focused on that. I'm wanting to be the high performance coach for creators. Podcasts, I want to focus on that and not so much how to create a podcast or how to do a great YouTube intro, but these are all things I have to learn in order to help with the main goal of the podcast. I want to be tracking engagement. I want people, if you're listening to this, I'd love for you to take a survey, and that's the call of action today. The one thing I hope you do before you leave, which is down to the show notes, but to take a survey to help me get some feedback on the show. So I'm tracking that through engagement, and engagement could be something like filling out a survey. And if you fill out the survey too, you'll qualify for a free 1 hour of coaching with me about whatever you are focused on in your life. Applying the high performance process will get you a plan and something you can do right off the bat to help advance your life. And I just would love to meet you and learn more about what's going on and how I can help, or how this show can help you. So that's the whole gist of this feedback form. But engagement could also be leaving reviews or leaving comments on the various things. And I know in this show, I've been very terrible with asking for specific things and for being consistent with asking for engagement. So as I'm sharing, this isn't anything that I'm saying that I'm perfect at. I'm in it too, trying to figure this out. And luckily there's mentors and tons of information on things. So I'll be reporting back probably at the end of this year with how this survey went, with how the changes to the podcast have been since I started this last month. So if you want, again, to help show that you're engaged, fill out that worksheet that's down at the bottom, or you could go to a bit.ly link, bit.ly/mrkey-feedback. And that little link should get you to the form, which leads me to something cool that happened to me this past week. I was at the Notion Make event. This is all relevant to the feedback form. And because I was there, I got access to the Notion Forms feature that they just released. Or they haven't released for everyone, but for people that were at this event. So you might be thinking, what is Notion? Notion is like a Evernote on steroids. So it's a note-taking app where you can create databases on the fly. It's how I organize and run this show, with research to tracking episodes and guests and all the different bits of information that go up on YouTube and the podcasting app and everything. I love Notion, and I'm trying out this new feature. If you love Notion and you're like, what is this form feature? If you go to the link, you'll see it in action. If you have never used Notion and don't care about it and just want to help me out and be cool and take the quick 10-minute survey, to help me improve the podcast, I'd really appreciate it too. And if you're like, I don't want to do anything, I'm just here to listen, totally get that too. No pressure on providing feedback, but again, it would really help me out. So maybe a little bit of pressure. So that's the short thing of what happened at the Notion event. It's one of the main things. And so I can go into that if you guys want. Just provide feedback on the feedback forum if you want to hear about my experience at the Notion Make event. Otherwise, yeah, you probably don't care, so I won't talk about it on the podcast. So how does this help you grow? Again, you have to be measuring what matters. Remember, for podcasting, that is not tracking downloads. It's tracking engagement. How can we track engagement, right? Again, it's tracking link clicks or ratings. It's having structured goals in the episode that you're measuring yourself. I've been really focused on getting the beginning part of the podcast very dialed in to generate interest and listening to the rest of the episode, just being super transparent. So there's certain metrics that I'm measuring for myself, and how quick am I communicating from the title to delivering what the title says. And I want that to be super quick. So it's just something I'm experimenting with right now. So those are the two things that I'm really working on about how to track engagement. The other thing with having a small show is that if you don't have enough people listening on the platforms that you're tracking the measurements on, so at basically Apple or Spotify, they don't give you helpful data to help improve the performance of your show, right? It's just a lot of stuff, it's not enough data, it's blank, which is not great. So at the end of the day, you have, for this podcast, maybe for me and my thing, I'll have a little bit more clarity on what people like or what they don't like, on how to improve the show, or things that, if I know what you absolutely love about the show, I will do more of it. And if there's things that you absolutely hate other than me and my voice, you just don't listen to the show at that point, I will do my best to change or to at least try it out, right? I'm all for running short-term experiments to see how things feel or to make the show more valuable to you. And of course, when you have a clear experiment to try and you have the courage to actually implement it for a little bit, and you have metrics that you're measuring internally or externally to help judge how well it does, that's all we can really hope for from a performance standpoint. When it comes to making a change to the show, changing anything can seem extremely scary. And especially when you don't know it's actually working for you or it's getting people to stop listening, right? Is it not relevant? Is it the title isn't really clear on what people are getting out of it? You're not introducing an episode correctly. There's a million things where things can go wrong. And if you don't have a grasp on what's actually working and what's actually not working to your detriment, you're going to make mistakes. All right. Now we're in this new segment of the show called Metaphor, Magic, or Mishap, where I come up with a metaphor on the fly that's either going to really encapsulate what we're talking about or not quite cut it. It's fun. I hope you enjoy this. Let's get to it. So if I were to think of a metaphor for feedback, especially in the case of this podcast, for me, I'm basically using the Force to measure the success and the growth of this show. So I can go out and get some Jedi to train me, but it still seems magical and at the will of these secret unknown forces. By taking the survey that's in the show notes below and helping provide me feedback, it's helping move things from less mystical and more into a science, more of a analytical realm that can actually be helpful. So I hope you do that. Please, again, take 10 minutes to do feedback in the show notes. What I loved about this particular episode of The Meaningful Revolution is that I love sharing something that I'm actively working on with y'all. I don't have this all figured out, and I thought you might like a little bit more behind the scenes or a little bit of a snapshot into what's going on in the podcast, especially since I'm asking for feedback, feel free to fill out that survey. Again, in the show notes, I'll say this a bajillion times. I'd love for you to take that survey, so just fill it out below. And with that said, if you loved this video, be sure to fill out the survey below and check out these videos from the podcast about clarity, because ultimately feedback is about getting clear about what's working, what's not working, or things you're not even thinking about. So finding blind spots. And as a high performance coach, I'm always helping people figure out how to clarify their goals, how to be clear on their values and how they're showing up. And so we have some other episodes for you to check in the show notes, or if you're watching on YouTube, over here. So with that, this is the end of the Meaningful Revolution podcast. This is Sean Butner signing off, and we'll see you guys next week.